What would you do if your 5-year-old came back from death with a chilling message from Jesus? That's exactly what happened to Emily, a bright, lively little girl who saw something that has left her family and community shaken. Her story isn't just about light and peace. It's about a warning for humanity, one so urgent and terrifying that it could change everything. Was it a glimpse of heaven or something far more unsettling?
The Addams family seemed to belong in a Norman Rockwell painting tucked away in the quiet, picturesque town of Ravenwood, Oregon. This rural gem, with its sprawling green fields and pine-dotted horizons, offered a life so serene it could almost be a dream. It was the kind of town where car horns were replaced by friendly waves, and strangers quickly became neighbors. Faith was the cornerstone of the community, binding people together through shared potlucks, Friday night football games, and the collective hum of hymns on Sunday mornings. Rachel Addams was more than just a school librarian. She was a storyteller extraordinaire. Her love for books was contagious, and her animated readings made even the most reluctant reader sit up and listen. Whether it was wearing a ridiculous hat or putting on her best dragon voice, Rachel had a way of making stories leap off the pages. She often said, "Books don't just tell stories, they create adventures." At home, this passion didn't wane. Emily, her 5-year-old daughter, would drift off to sleep every night with her mom, spinning tales about enchanted forests, brave princesses, and talking animals. For Rachel, storytelling was her way of keeping magic alive in her family's life. Her husband, Thomas, was her perfect counterpart. While Rachel wove magic with her words, Thomas built it with his hands. As a carpenter, his work was his pride. Every piece of furniture in their home bore his craftsmanship, from the hand-carved rocking chair in the living room to Emily's tiny princess-themed bed adorned with delicate engravings. "If you're going to build something, build it to last," he often said, his mantra evident in every nail and joint. Thomas's laugh was hearty and infectious, a sound that could fill a room, and his love for his family was as solid as the foundations he built. Then there was Emily, their vibrant 5-year-old whirlwind of joy and curiosity. Emily wasn't just a little girl. She was a burst of sunshine in human form. Her wild curls framed a face always lit with wonder, and her sparkling eyes hinted at the endless questions bubbling inside her. "Mommy, if rainbows are God's promise, why don't they stay forever?" she once asked, her tiny hands gesturing dramatically. She loved to draw, creating masterpieces with crayons and glitter that covered every surface of the Addams home. She also had a knack for singing impromptu songs, twirling in her princess dress until she collapsed in giggles. Her energy was infectious, her laughter brightening even the rainiest of Ravenwood's days. For the Addams family, life was full of the simple joys that made small-town living special. Weekdays were bustling with work and school, but weekends were sacred. Pancake breakfasts were a family tradition, often turning into flower fights that left the kitchen looking like a winter wonderland. Afternoons were spent exploring the nearby woods, building birdhouses, or lying on the grass, gazing at the stars. Emily, always fascinated by the night sky, loved imagining what lay beyond. "Do angels live on stars, Daddy?" she asked one night, her voice filled with awe. Thomas chuckled and replied, "If they do, they're probably building houses just like me." These moments were the glue that held the family together, a life of love, laughter, and wonder. Ravenwood, too, played a role in their idyllic life. The town was more than a backdrop. It was part of their identity. Neighbors waved as they passed. The local diner knew everyone's order, and the church was a second home. Emily's antics were well known in the community, and her drawings were often featured on the bulletin board at the library where Rachel worked. It was a place where people looked out for each other, where problems seemed small and life felt safe. But life has a way of shifting when you least expect it. It doesn't come with warnings or gentle nudges. It barrels in, uninvited, and changes everything. The Addams family, wrapped in their cozy, love-filled bubble, had no reason to think anything would disrupt their world. They had faith in each other and a life so full it seemed untouchable. As Rachel tucked Emily into bed one night, listening to her little girl chatter about fairies and stars, she couldn't have known how precious this normalcy would soon feel. As Thomas carved a new rocking chair in his workshop, humming to himself, he didn't realize how soon his steady hands would be needed for something far more urgent. In the living room, Emily, twirling in her princess dress, giggled without a care in the world, unaware of how her life was about to change in ways no 5-year-old could comprehend. Because sometimes life shifts in ways you can't prepare for. The Addams family was about to face something they never imagined that would test their faith, strength, and understanding of the world itself. Who could have guessed that this lively, love-filled family, brimming with joy and energy, was about to encounter the greatest nightmare of their lives?
They can see ongoing earthly events, often including people frantically trying to bring them back to life.
It all started when Emily complained of a headache one morning while munching on her favorite cereal. "Mommy, my head feels funny," she said, squinting as if the light from the window was too much. Rachel brushed it off with a kiss on her daughter's forehead. "Probably too much twirling yesterday, little star," she teased, trying to coax a smile. Emily managed a faint giggle, but it didn't last long. That night, the headache was joined by stomach pain. Emily tossed and turned, clutching her belly like a pirate protecting treasure. "It feels weird," she whispered, her little voice breaking with discomfort. Thomas tried to lighten the mood by calling her Captain Emily and suggesting she'd eaten too many cookies from the treasure chest. Emily tried to laugh, but couldn't muster the strength. Something was clearly off, but neither Rachel nor Thomas could have guessed how serious it would get. The next day, Emily's energy was gone. The once lively, chatty 5-year-old who could spend hours spinning stories about fairies now sat listlessly on the couch, her eyes droopy and her skin pale. Her forehead was warm, too warm. Rachel felt her stomach twist. "Maybe it's just the flu," she told Thomas, though the worry in her voice betrayed her. They called Dr. Myers, the friendly small-town physician who'd always been there for the family. Dr. Myers greeted them with his usual calm demeanor, the kind that made you feel like everything would be okay. "Sounds like a stomach virus," he said after a quick examination. "Make sure she stays hydrated. Some rest and fluids, and she'll be back to her old self in no time." Rachel wanted to believe him. She really did. But as they drove home, Emily's cries of pain echoed in her mind. By the following morning, Emily's symptoms had taken a sharp turn. She was vomiting everything she tried to eat or drink. Her fever spiked so high that Rachel panicked, calling Thomas at work. "She's burning up, Tom. I think we need to take her back." When Thomas arrived, Emily was curled up on the couch, her little body trembling. Her normally rosy cheeks were flushed a deep red, and her breathing seemed shallow. Thomas scooped her up in his arms, his voice breaking as he whispered, "We're going to get you better, sweetheart." Back at Dr. Myers' office, the concern on his face this time was impossible to miss. He ordered a series of tests, his usual confidence replaced by a furrowed brow. But before they could wait for results, Emily's condition worsened right in front of him. She slumped forward, her eyes fluttering shut. "You need to get her to Portland General immediately," he said, his voice firm. "This is beyond what we can handle here." The drive to Portland felt like the longest 2 hours of their lives. Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched as if sheer determination could will Emily to hold on. Rachel sat in the back seat with Emily cradled in her arms, her heart pounding as she whispered prayers she hadn't said in years. The countryside blurred past them, but neither parent noticed. Their entire world was reduced to the little girl in Rachel's lap, the girl who wasn't responding to her name. By the time they arrived at Portland General Hospital, Emily was nearly unconscious. Nurses and doctors swarmed her like a well-oiled machine, wheeling her away before Rachel could even say goodbye. The couple stood frozen in the bustling hallway, the emptiness of their arms hitting them like a wave. A nurse handed Rachel a clipboard with paperwork, but her hands trembled too much to hold the pen. It didn't take long for the doctors to uncover the truth, a truth that felt like a punch to the gut. Emily was not battling a stomach virus or the flu. She had a ruptured brain aneurysm, a rare and deadly condition, especially for someone so young. The rupture had caused bleeding and swelling in her brain, putting her life in immediate danger. The surgeon, Dr. Patel, spoke quickly and clearly, but Rachel only caught fragments. Emergency surgery, slim chance, critical condition. Rachel's knees buckled, and Thomas caught her before she hit the ground. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's just a little girl. She was fine a week ago." Thomas held her close, his own tears threatening to spill over. He wanted to say something reassuring, but what could he say? There was no handbook for this kind of fear. The operating room was prepped in record time. Before Emily was wheeled in, Rachel and Thomas were allowed a brief moment with her. Rachel kissed her daughter's forehead, her lips lingering as if trying to imprint the moment into her memory. "You're my brave girl," she said softly, though her voice wavered. Thomas bent down and whispered, "We'll be right here when you wake up, okay? Daddy's got you." Emily didn't respond. She was too far gone, her tiny body limp on the stretcher. The last thing Rachel saw before the doors swung shut was a teddy bear tucked under Emily's arm, its soft brown fur a stark contrast to the cold sterility of the hospital. The waiting room became their purgatory, a place where time moved both too fast and too slow. Rachel sat hunched over, her hands clasped tightly as she muttered prayers under her breath. Thomas paced the room like a restless lion, his hands running through his hair every few minutes. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your chest ache and your breath come short. Hours passed, though neither of them could have said how many. Every time a nurse or doctor walked through the doors, their heads snapped up, searching for answers. Finally, Dr. Patel emerged, his expression unreadable. "She made it through the surgery," he said, pausing just long enough for relief to flood their faces before continuing. "But she's not out of the woods yet. The next 24 hours will be critical." Relief and dread collided in Rachel's chest. They had a sliver of hope, but the fight wasn't over. Thomas sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands, while Rachel reached out to the surgeon. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for giving her a chance." They were allowed to see Emily briefly in the ICU. The sight of her hooked up to machines and monitors, her head wrapped in bandages, was almost too much to bear. But Rachel forced herself to stay strong, leaning close to whisper, "We're here, baby. Mommy and Daddy are right here." For Thomas and Rachel, this was the longest night of their lives. They took turns sitting by Emily's bedside, their eyes glued to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Every sound, every movement made their hearts leap. They prayed silently, desperately for a miracle. But what was happening inside Emily during those hours? Where was her mind as her body lay motionless under the hospital's cold, clinical lights? And what did she see when she crossed the fragile boundary between life and death? So, rewinding back a few hours, the operating room was a flurry of urgency. Bright surgical lights glared down on Emily's small, fragile body, surrounded by doctors and nurses who moved with precision. Dr. Patel gave clear, sharp instructions, his voice steady despite the chaos. Emily's heart monitor beeped steadily, a tiny reassurance in a room where every second counted. But then, without warning, the beeping slowed and then stopped. A piercing flatline cut through the air. For a brief moment, the room froze. Nurses exchanged tense glances, and Dr. Patel called out for adrenaline. The team sprang into action, trying to revive her, but something remarkable was happening that no one in that room could see. Emily, lying motionless on the table, later described it as the moment she floated. "I felt so light," Emily told her parents weeks later, her voice soft but certain. It was like I was not in my body anymore. I was above it, looking down. She described the scene in vivid detail. The doctors working frantically, the tools gleaming under the harsh lights, the anxious expressions on their faces. Dr. Patel kept saying, "Stay with us, Emily," she recalled, mimicking his concerned tone. Thomas and Rachel sat stunned as they listened. How could their 5-year-old possibly know the surgeon's name? They hadn't even told her. And the detail she provided, the way she described the nurse adjusting the IV line or the surgical tech handing over a small metallic tool, was far too precise for a child who had been unconscious. Rachel felt a chill run down her spine, a mix of awe and disbelief. "Were you scared?" she asked quietly. Emily shook her head. "No, Mommy. I was not scared at all. I felt safe." Her sense of calm, she explained, came from the fact that she was not just watching the operating room. As she hovered above her own body, Emily said she felt drawn away, as if being gently carried. The room around her grew blurry, fading into a warm golden light that seemed to come from everywhere. "It was more like sunlight," she said, scrunching her nose in thought. "It was brighter, but it didn't hurt my eyes. It felt like a big hug. Emily's journey didn't stop there. She described being drawn through what she called a tunnel, though she struggled to find the right words. Not really a tunnel, but it felt like I was moving, like floating, and the light got brighter and brighter. Rachel clutched Thomas's hand as Emily's voice grew more animated, her face lighting up as she recounted what she saw. "There were people there," Emily said with a small smile. "They were happy, like they were waiting for me." She described figures glowing with a soft radiance, their faces kind and welcoming. One of them looked like Grandpa Joe, but not old. He looked young, like the picture in the hallway. Rachel gasped. Emily had never met her great-grandfather, who had passed away decades earlier. She certainly hadn't seen enough photos to recognize him. But Emily had more to say. "There was a garden," she continued, her voice filled with wonder. "It was so pretty. The flowers had colors I've never seen before, and they smelled so good. Everything was alive, like it was singing." Rachel blinked back tears, her mind racing to make sense of it all. How could Emily describe this with such clarity? The most striking part of Emily's story, though, was not the garden or the glowing figures. It was who she met next. "There was a man," she said, her tone shifting to one of quiet reverence. "He had kind eyes and a big sim-like little holes. He had these marks on his hands and holes." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He didn't need to ask who Emily was describing. "He said his name was Jesus," Emily added simply as if she were talking about a friendly neighbor. Rachel's eyes widened. "What did he say to you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel's reaction was completely understandable, especially since this isn't the first time someone with a near-death experience has described meeting such extraordinary figures. Take Scott Drummond, for example. He shared a remarkably similar encounter. Emily looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. "He said I didn't have to be afraid. He said I was really brave, and that he loved me." She paused, fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "But then, he said I couldn't stay. He said I had to go back because you and Daddy needed me." Her voice faltered, and tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't want to leave. It was so nice there." Rachel pulled Emily into her arms, holding her tightly as tears streamed down her face. Thomas stared at the floor, his mind spinning. He wanted to believe his daughter, but how could any of this be real? How could a child describe heaven, Jesus, and loved ones she'd never met with such detail? Emily's story didn't end with her encounter with Jesus. She claimed she had seen her parents too, though not in the operating room. "I saw you in a little room," she told them. "You were crying, Mommy, and Daddy, you were sitting with your head down, like you were praying." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had spent hours in the hospital chapel while Emily was in surgery, sobbing and clutching her rosary. Thomas had paced outside the chapel, his hands clasped in silent prayer. They hadn't told Emily any of this. How could she have known? "I saw other people too," Emily added, her voice growing quieter. "They looked sad. They were sitting outside the light. They couldn't come in." Rachel and Thomas exchanged a glance, uneasy at this new detail. Who were these people? Why couldn't they come into the light? Emily didn't have answers. "Jesus said they were waiting," she explained, though even she didn't seem to fully understand. Her parents sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything she had shared. The precision of her descriptions and the emotions in her voice were all too much to dismiss as imagination. "Do you remember anything else?" Thomas finally asked. Emily hesitated, as if she were unsure whether to continue. "I remember the music," she said softly. "It was not like music here. It was everywhere, like it was part of the light. It made me feel so happy." She looked up at her parents, her young eyes filled with wisdom far beyond her years. "I think heaven is where love comes from." Rachel couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She hugged Emily tightly, her heart swelling with both gratitude and disbelief. Thomas reached out, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "You're our miracle," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. But as Emily drifted off to sleep that night, her parents couldn't shake the questions her story had raised. Was this truly a glimpse of heaven? Or was there another explanation? And what about the figures she had seen outside the light? Were they part of her imagination, or something else entirely? And most importantly, why had Emily been sent back? What was it that Jesus needed her to do? But that's not all to the story. Emily's experience of two worlds was more to it. Emily felt herself drifting, weightless, through an endless expanse of warm, golden light. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced, soft yet so vibrant it seemed alive. The light wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, and she was not afraid for the first time in what felt like forever. The pain, the fear, the noise of the hospital, all of it was gone. As she floated, she began to hear something faint at first, like the hum of a distant melody. It grew clearer and fuller until it filled the space around her. It was more than like any music she'd ever heard. It was everywhere, flowing through the air. The sound made her chest feel warm, like a blanket wrapping her heart. "It's so pretty," Emily whispered to herself, though there was no one nearby to hear her. Then she saw them, beings of light, glowing with a radiance that didn't hurt to look at, even though it was so bright. They moved gracefully, almost like they were dancing, and she could feel the music flowing from them. "Are you angels?" Emily asked softly, her voice trembling with awe. They didn't speak back to her, but somehow she understood. They were welcoming her, their presence gentle and loving. As Emily moved closer to the light, the colors around her began to change. They were brighter and richer than any she had ever seen, as though the world she had known before was only drawn in crayon. And this was the real thing. The flowers were vivid, their petals shimmering with colors she couldn't name, and the trees seemed alive, not just with movement, but with purpose. "It's like everything is happy here," she thought, her eyes wide as she took it all in. A voice called her name then, soft and warm, yet powerful. "Emily," the voice said, gentle but sure. She turned and saw him. The light surrounding him was brighter than anything else, and yet she could see his face clearly. His eyes were kind, and his smile felt like the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "Jesus," she whispered, though she didn't know how she knew his name. It simply felt right. "Hello, Emily," he said. His tone was so full of love that it made her want to cry. "You've come a long way." Emily took a hesitant step closer, feeling drawn to him. "Where am I?" she asked, looking around at the garden full of singing flowers and glowing trees. "You're in a place that's not quite heaven, but close to it," Jesus explained. "You've been brought here to see and to learn." Emily tilted her head, trying to understand. "To learn what?" she asked, her curiosity growing. Jesus knelt down, so he was at eye level with her, his expression soft but serious. "To learn about love," he said, "and to see the things that matter most." She felt a new presence nearby before Emily could ask what he meant. She turned and saw a boy standing a little ways off, watching her with a shy smile. He looked about her age, with dark hair and bright eyes that seemed to sparkle like the stars she loved to look at back home. He stepped forward, his hands tucked nervously behind his back. "Hi, Emily," he said softly. Emily blinked at him, tilting her head in confusion. "How do you know my name?" she asked. The boy's smile grew, though there was something bittersweet in it. "Because I've been watching you," he said. "I've been waiting to meet you." Emily frowned, unsure of what he meant. "Waiting for me? Why?" The boy took another step closer, his hands now hanging at his sides. "I'm your brother," he said simply. Emily froze, her mouth falling open. "My brother?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The boy nodded, his gaze steady. "You didn't get to meet me before," he said, "but I've always been with you." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, though she didn't understand why. She had always wished for a sibling, but her parents had never mentioned one. "But how?" she asked, her voice trembling. The boy's smile turned soft. "I didn't get to stay with Mommy and Daddy," he said. "I had to leave early, but I've been here, waiting for all of you." Emily stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch him. "You mean you were in heaven this whole time?" she asked. The boy nodded again, his own eyes shimmering. "And I'll be here when it's time for everyone to come home, but for now I get to see you, and that's enough." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest, filling her with a joy she couldn't put into words. She didn't need to understand everything to know that it felt right. She reached out and hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his glowing form. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," he replied. "And so do they." Emily pulled back, confused. "They?" she asked. The boy gestured behind her, and Emily turned to see a group of glowing figures standing in the distance. Some she recognized, faces she had seen in old photographs or heard about in bedtime stories. Others were strangers, but she felt an undeniable connection to all of them. They were smiling, their warmth reaching her even from far away. "They're all part of your family," the boy explained. "They've been watching over you, just like me." Emily's heart swelled, and she felt like she might burst with happiness. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something else. Beyond the light and the glowing figures, there was something darker, shadows lurking at the edges of the garden. She turned to Jesus, her small hand gripping his robe. "What's that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jesus' expression grew serious, though his kindness never left. "Those are the places where the light doesn't reach," he said. "They're waiting." "Waiting for what?" Emily asked, her fear creeping back in. "For people to choose," Jesus replied. "The shadows only grow when people forget love and kindness. But they can't come here." Emily nodded, though she didn't fully understand. She looked back at the boy, who reached out and took her hand. "Don't worry," he said gently. "You're safe here." She smiled at him, feeling reassured. But as she stood there, surrounded by light and love, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she needed to understand. The shadows weren't far, and something told her they wouldn't stay that way forever. And though she didn't know it yet, her journey was far from over. What would the light show her next? In the dazzling light, Emily felt an overwhelming sense of peace. as if the worries of the world had dissolved into nothing. She stood in what seemed like an endless expanse, surrounded by warmth and colors so bright and alive they defied description. Yet, as beautiful as everything around her was, her attention was drawn to a figure standing a short distance away. He was radiant. His presence exuded love and kindness, but there was also a deep sadness in his expression. Emily didn't need an introduction. She somehow knew who he was, the way you recognize someone you've known your whole life. "Jesus?" she said softly, her small voice barely audible. He turned toward her and smiled, though there was something bittersweet in it. "Hello, Emily," he said, his voice calm and steady, like a melody you'd never forget. "I've been waiting to talk to you." Emily felt safe, like nothing could harm her as long as he was near. She tilted her head, curiosity sparking in her big brown eyes. "Where am I?" she asked, looking around at the glowing garden filled with flowers and trees that seemed to hum with life. "You're in a place between," Jesus explained. "You've come here because there's something important I need to show you." Emily blinked. "Something important? Like a secret?" Jesus chuckled softly, the sound like a comforting breeze. "In a way," he said. "But it's not just for you. It's for everyone." He reached out his hand, and Emily instinctively took it. His touch was warm and comforting, like holding a ray of sunlight. Together, they began to walk, the ground beneath them shimmering like golden glass. As they moved, Emily noticed the colors around them shifting. The vibrant light dimmed slightly, and she felt a heaviness she hadn't felt before. "What's happening?" she asked, her small hand tightening around his. "I need you to see something," Jesus said gently. "Something that's already happening in the world." Suddenly, the light around them faded completely, and Emily found herself standing on the edge of a vast darkness. She could see glimpses of earth below, as if looking through a window into another world. But the images weren't happy. She saw people arguing, their faces twisted with anger. She saw children crying, clutching at empty plates. She saw fires consuming forests and waves crashing over entire towns. "Why are they so sad?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Jesus knelt beside her, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Because they've forgotten," he said softly. "Forgotten what?" Emily asked, confused. "They've forgotten how to love," he replied. His voice was steady, but Emily could hear the sadness in it. "They've chosen anger instead of forgiveness, selfishness instead of kindness, and fear instead of faith." Emily's heart ached as she watched the scenes unfold before her. People were yelling, fighting, and hurting one another in ways she couldn't understand. "Can't you fix it?" she asked, looking up at him with wide, pleading eyes. "I've tried," Jesus said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've sent messages, given them love, and shown them the way, but they must choose to listen." Emily frowned, trying to make sense of it. "What happens if they don't?" Jesus hesitated for a moment, then stood and stretched out his hand. The view changed. Now Emily saw disasters she couldn't comprehend, cities crumbling, forests disappearing, and people running in fear. She saw empty fields where crops should grow, and skies filled with smoke instead of sunlight. "If they don't change, this is what will come," Jesus said, his voice tinged with sadness. Emily's chest tightened, and a lump formed in her throat. "But why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why does it have to be like that?" "Because every choice has a consequence," Jesus explained. "When people choose hate over love, they create pain. When they choose greed over generosity, they create loss. The world can only carry so much of that before it begins to break." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she watched the devastation unfold. "It's so scary," she whispered. "I don't want it to happen." Jesus knelt beside her again and placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's why you're here, Emily," he said. "You've been chosen to carry a message." Emily blinked up at him, her tears spilling over. "Me? But I'm just a kid." Jesus smiled, his expression filled with gentle reassurance. "That's why they'll listen to you," he said. "Your heart is pure, and your words will carry my love." "But what if they don't listen?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "What if I can't do it?" Jesus took both of her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I'll be with you every step of the way. All you have to do is share what you've seen and felt." Emily nodded slowly, though her heart still felt heavy. "What do I tell them?" she asked. "Tell them to love," Jesus said simply. "Love each other, love the world, and love me. That love is the only thing that can heal what's broken." Emily swallowed hard and looked back at the darkness. She wanted to turn away, but something inside her told her she needed to see it. As scary as it was, she knew it was important. "Can they fix it?" she asked after a long pause. "Is it too late?" Jesus smiled, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It's never too late," he said, "but they must choose to change." Emily took a deep breath, her small shoulders lifting with determination. "I'll tell them," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'll tell them everything." Jesus stood and extended his hand again. As Emily took it, the light around them began to return, washing away the darkness. The warmth and color of the garden enveloped her once more, and she felt a sense of peace, unlike anything she had ever known. "You're so brave, Emily," Jesus said as they walked back toward the glowing expanse. "Remember, you were chosen for this because you have a heart full of love." Emily looked up at him and smiled, though her tears still lingered. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Jesus stopped and knelt beside her once more. "I'll always be with you," he said, placing a gentle hand over her heart. "And when it's time, I'll be waiting for you here." Emily felt the warmth of his touch spread through her chest, filling her with a sense of courage she hadn't known she had. She nodded, her tiny hand gripping his tightly. "I won't forget," she promised. As the garden began to fade, Emily felt herself being pulled gently away. The light grew dimmer, and the sounds of the heavenly music began to soften. But she didn't feel afraid. She carried his words with her like a flame burning brightly in her heart. And as she left that radiant place, she knew one thing for certain. She had a mission. Would the world be ready to listen? Be ready to... Emily was basking in the golden warmth of the garden when she suddenly felt a shift. The air seemed to change, growing heavier and colder. She turned to Jesus, her small hand still tucked in his. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice tinged with panic. Jesus knelt to meet her gaze, his eyes filled with both love and something deeper, a sadness that made her chest ache. "It's time for you to go back, Emily," he said gently. Her stomach dropped. "Go back?" she repeated, shaking her head. "But I want to stay here. I don't want to leave you." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face with infinite tenderness. "I know," he said softly, "but there's still work for you to do. Your family needs you, and so do others." Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Can't they come here with me instead?" she asked, her voice breaking. Jesus smiled, though his sadness didn't fade. "One day, Emily. But not yet." Before she could protest further, she felt it, a force tugging at her, pulling her away from the warmth and light. "No!" she cried, clinging to his hand. "I don't want to go." "It's not goodbye," Jesus said, his voice steady but kind. "I'll always be with you." Emily's grip loosened as the pull grew stronger. The golden garden began to blur, the colors fading into gray. She tried to call out to him one last time, but her voice was lost in the growing darkness. Then came the cold, a sharp, biting chill that made her whole body tremble. She felt like she was falling, spinning, disoriented and lost. The warmth she had felt in the garden seemed like a distant memory. And then, pain. A deep, aching pain that jolted her fully awake. Emily gasped, her eyes snapping open. The bright, sterile lights of the hospital burned her eyes, and the cold, hard surface of the bed beneath her felt alien and uncomfortable. Her chest heaved as she struggled to breathe, her small body racked with a discomfort she couldn't explain. "Emily!" a familiar voice cried. She turned her head slowly, her vision blurry, and saw her mother, Rachel, leaning over her, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, thank God," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, smoothing Emily's damp hair back from her forehead. "You're back, baby. You're back." Beside her, Thomas stood frozen, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Emily," he choked out, his voice barely audible. "We thought we lost you." Emily tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw him," she managed to say, her words slurred and faint. Rachel's brow furrowed. "What, sweetheart?" "Saw who?" "Jesus," Emily whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I was with him." Rachel and Thomas exchanged a glance, their relief quickly replaced by confusion. "Honey, you've been through a lot," Thomas said carefully. "You had surgery, and the doctors said you were very sick." But Emily shook her head weakly. "No, I was with Jesus," she insisted. "He showed me things, beautiful things." Rachel forced a smile, brushing a tear from her cheek. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're awake now. That's all that matters." But Emily wouldn't stop. Her small hand reached out, clutching her mother's wrist with surprising strength. "Mommy, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling but urgent. "I went to a garden. It was so bright, and there were flowers that sang." Rachel froze, her smile faltering. "Flowers that sang?" she repeated, trying to keep her tone light. "That sounds like a dream, sweetie." Emily shook her head again, more firmly this time. "It wasn't a dream," she insisted. "I was there. I saw Jesus. He told me I had to come back because you needed me." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his hands rubbing over his face. "Emily, honey, sometimes when we're really sick, our brains can make things up. It's called a dream. Or maybe it was the medicine the doctors gave you." Emily's frustration grew. "It was not the medicine," she exclaimed, her voice rising with emotion. "I saw him, and he told me about my brother." Both Rachel and Thomas froze, their expressions turning to shock. Your brother?" Rachel stammered. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "He was there, Mommy. He said he didn't get to stay with us, but he's waiting for us." Rachel's hand flew to her mouth as she began to sob. Thomas stared at Emily, his face pale and his eyes wide. "How do you know about that?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We've never talked about him." Emily looked at her father, confused. "Jesus told me," she said simply, "and my brother hugged me. He said he watches over us. Watches over." The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on all of them. Rachel sat down heavily in the chair beside Emily's bed, her hands trembling. "She couldn't have known," she whispered, almost to herself. Thomas shook his head, his mind racing. It's impossible," he murmured. But deep down, he felt a crack in the wall of his skepticism. Emily's small voice cut through the silence. "Jesus showed me other things, too. He said people have to change, or bad things will happen." Thomas and Rachel looked at each other again, their confusion deepening. "What do you mean, bad things?" Rachel asked cautiously. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to explain. "People were fighting," she said, her voice trembling. "And there were fires and big waves, and so much sadness. Jesus said it's because people don't love enough. They don't listen to him. Rachel reached for Thomas's hand, gripping it tightly. Neither of them knew what to say. How could their 5-year-old be describing these things? And how could she be so certain? "Emily," Thomas said gently, kneeling beside her bed. "Are you sure this wasn't just a dream?" Emily met his gaze, her expression firm despite the tears on her cheeks. "I know I was not dreaming, Daddy," she said. "It felt more real than anything else. And Jesus told me I had to tell people." Rachel's heart ached as she watched her daughter, so small and fragile, yet speaking with a conviction that seemed far beyond her years. "Tell people what?" she asked softly. Emily's voice softened, but her words carried an unshakable strength. "That they have to love more," she said. "Each other, the world, and him. That's the only way to make the bad things go away." Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind swirling with questions he didn't know how to ask. Rachel leaned forward, placing a hand on Emily's cheek. "We believe you, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We just need some time to understand." Emily nodded, her energy fading as exhaustion took over. "I'm tired," she murmured, her eyelids drooping. Rachel kissed her forehead gently. "Rest now," she said, though her mind was anything but calm. As Emily drifted off to sleep, her parents sat in silence, grappling with the impossible story their daughter had just told them. Could it really be true? Or was it something else entirely? And if it was true, what did it mean for their lives? And for the world? Secrets no child should know. Emily's recovery seemed almost miraculous, but the days following her return were ordinary. Rachel and Thomas noticed it immediately. Emily was not just their bubbly 5-year-old anymore. She spoke with a clarity and calm that felt far beyond her years. And then there were the details, the things she couldn't have known. It started innocently enough. One evening, Rachel sat by Emily's bedside, stroking her daughter's hair, while Thomas dozed in the corner chair. Emily stirred and opened her eyes. "Mommy," she said softly. "The doctor was worried." When my heart stopped, Rachel froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice careful. Emily looked at her mother, her small hands gripping the blanket. "I saw them," she said. "The doctors. They were using a tool, the one with the handle and the long part that beeps." She mimicked, holding something in her hand, her tiny fingers curling around an imaginary device. Rachel's blood ran cold. "A defibrillator?" she whispered to herself. "They pressed it on me," Emily continued. And then the nurse said, "She's back. But you weren't there, Mommy. You were praying." Rachel's heart stopped. She had been in the hospital chapel at that exact moment, praying desperately for Emily's life. How could she have known that? Thomas stirred in his chair, groaning as he rubbed his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked groggily. Rachel turned to him, her face pale. "Emily. She says she saw the doctors during surgery." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Honey, she must have overheard someone talking about it." But Emily shook her head. "I was not awake, Daddy. I was with Jesus." Thomas's skepticism faltered as Emily began recounting more. She spoke of Rachel in the chapel, on her knees with her hands clasped tightly, whispering words Emily shouldn't have known. "You said, 'Please bring her back to us. I'll never ask for anything else,'" Emily said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Rachel gasped, tears filling her eyes. She had spoken those exact words alone, and broken in the stillness of the chapel. She hadn't even told Thomas about it. "How do you know that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Emily looked at her mother. Her face was calm, but her eyes were wide, and she had a kind of wisdom that didn't belong to a child. "I saw you," she said simply. Jesus showed me. Thomas sat up straighter, his skepticism beginning to crack. "What else did you see, Emily?" he asked, his voice firmer now. Emily hesitated as if unsure whether she should share. Finally, she spoke. "I saw Grandpa Joe," she said quietly, looking at Thomas. "He said he misses you." Thomas froze, his mouth opening, but no words came out. His father, Joe, had passed away when Emily was just a baby. She wouldn't have any memory of him. "What did he look like?" Thomas finally managed to ask. "He was younger," Emily said, smiling slightly. "Not like the pictures. He said he was proud of you for being a good dad." Thomas's hands trembled as he rubbed his face to keep his composure. Rachel reached out to him, her own tears falling freely now. "She couldn't have known," Rachel whispered. "There's no way." Her small face grew serious, her gaze lowering to the blanket she clutched. "There's something else," she said hesitantly. "About the dark place." Rachel stiffened and Thomas leaned forward. "What dark place, sweetheart?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Emily swallowed hard. "I didn't want to look at it," she said, her voice quieter now. "But it was there, far away from the light. It felt cold and heavy, and there were people." Thomas frowned. "People," he repeated. Emily nodded. "They were all alone," she said, her small voice shaking. "They couldn't talk, but I could feel how sad they were. They were stuck in the shadows, and they couldn't get out." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "Did Jesus say what it was?" she asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Emily nodded slowly. "He said it was where people go when they don't choose love," she said. "He told me not to look at it for too long because it would make me sad." Rachel and Thomas exchanged a look, their expressions mirroring their disbelief and fear. "But you're safe now," Thomas said firmly, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't have to think about that place anymore." Emily nodded, though her small hands still trembled. "I know," she said, "but I can't forget it. Jesus said I needed to remember so I could tell people." Rachel's heart broke as she saw the fear in her daughter's eyes. She reached out, pulling Emily into her arms. "You don't have to carry this alone," she said softly. "We'll help you." Emily buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her small body trembling. "There's more," she whispered after a long silence. "About my brother." Rachel and Thomas froze again. "What about him, sweetheart?" Rachel asked, her voice barely audible. Emily pulled back, looking up at her parents with wide, tear-filled eyes. "His name is Michael," she said simply. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Rachel and Thomas stared at each other, their disbelief turning to shock. How do you know that name?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. "Jesus told me," Emily said. "And Michael said he's been watching over us. He said he's happy, but he misses you." Rachel's tears came in full force now, her hands covering her face as she sobbed. Thomas wrapped his arms around her, his own tears streaming silently. Michael was the name they had chosen for the baby they lost years ago, a name they had never spoken aloud since. How could Emily have known? Emily's voice broke through the silence again. "He hugged me," she said softly, "and he said he can't wait to see us someday." Rachel and Thomas clung to each other, their emotions a mix of heartbreak and awe. "We believe you, Emily," Thomas said finally, his voice hoarse. "We believe you." But Emily had more to say. Her small voice trembled as she spoke again. "Jesus told me to tell people about the light," she said. "But he also said to tell them about the dark place." Rachel wiped her tears, her heart aching for her daughter. "What do you mean?" she asked gently. Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to her lap. "He said people need to know that they have to choose love," she said. "Because if they don't, they might end up in the dark place." Thomas swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. "Did he tell you why he chose you to share this?" he asked. Emily nodded. "He said it's because I have a big heart," she said simply, "and people will listen to me." Rachel kissed Emily's forehead, her tears falling again. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart," she said. "You're so brave." But even as Emily rested her head against her mother, Rachel and Thomas couldn't shake the weight of her words. How could their little girl carry such a burden? And how could they help her share a message that was both beautiful and terrifying? What would they do next? Faith tested by doubt. When Rachel and Thomas first shared Emily's story, they did it with the purest intentions. It was not about fame or attention. They truly believed Emily's experience was a gift, something meant to inspire others, to bring hope, faith, and love. They thought people would see it the way they did, as a miracle. At first, the response was overwhelming. Friends stopped by to listen, their eyes wide with wonder as Emily shared her account of meeting Jesus, the glowing garden, and even the heartbreaking revelation about her brother. The Johnsons from across the street brought over a casserole, saying how Emily's story reminded them of the importance of prayer. Pastor Greg invited them to speak at church, calling Emily's experience a divine testimony. But not everyone reacted with the same openness. Whispers started circulating in their small Oregon town of Ravenwood. It began subtly, a neighbor pausing a little too long when Rachel mentioned Emily's visions, or a friend deflecting the topic when it came up. Then came the questions that didn't sound as kind as they had in the beginning. "Are you sure it wasn't just the anesthesia?" One parent from Emily's school asked her to smile tight. Kids have such vivid imaginations. Others weren't so careful with their words. "You think maybe she's just repeating things she's heard in Sunday school?" Another neighbor commented casually at the grocery store. "I mean, kids soak that stuff up like sponges." Rachel brushed it off at first, telling herself it was just people being cautious. After all, Emily's story was extraordinary. Who wouldn't have questions? But the doubts began piling up. A post on the town's online forum questioned whether the Addams family was seeking attention. Another accused them of exploiting their daughter's dream for their own gain. Thomas, usually steady and calm, began to lose sleep over it. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night staring at his hands, the weight of the criticism wearing on him. "Why don't they believe us?" he asked Rachel one evening, his voice filled with frustration. "We're just telling the truth." Rachel, equally weary, sighed as she set her teacup down. "Because it's easier not to believe," she said. "It's safer for them to think it's just a story." What hurt most was when some of their closest friends started pulling away. The Millers, who used to invite them over for dinner every Sunday, stopped calling. The parents from Emily's school avoided eye contact at drop-off. Even at church, where they had always felt welcome, the air seemed to shift. Pastor Greg's enthusiasm waned as more congregants questioned Emily's story. "Maybe it's best if we don't talk about it so much," Greg suggested one morning after service, his tone hesitant. "Faith is personal, you know? Not everyone is ready to hear something so big." Rachel felt like she'd been punched in the gut. "You think we're pushing people away?" she asked. Greg shifted uncomfortably. "I just think maybe give people time. Let them come to their own conclusions." The backlash hit Emily the hardest. At just 5 years old, she didn't understand why people didn't believe her. "Why are they mad at me, Mommy?" she asked one evening, her big brown eyes filling with tears. "I didn't do anything wrong." Rachel pulled her into a tight hug, her heart breaking. "They're not mad at you, sweetheart," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she said them. "Sometimes people don't understand things they can't see." But the pressure on Emily only grew. At school, her classmates whispered about her behind her back. "She said she saw Jesus," one boy sneered during recess. "My mom says it's just a dream." Emily stopped wanting to play with her friends. She came home quieter, her usual spark dimmed. At night, she would cling to her stuffed bunny and ask Rachel to sit until she fell asleep. "I don't want to talk about it anymore," she said one evening, her voice small and tired. "It's too hard." Thomas tried to cheer her up, taking her out for ice cream and spending extra time with her in the backyard. But even he couldn't ignore the toll the scrutiny was taking on their little girl. "Maybe we should stop talking about it," he suggested to Rachel one evening, his voice heavy. "Let her move on." Rachel was not so sure. "But what about the message?" she asked. "Jesus told her to tell people. How can we just ignore that?" "Maybe we're not the ones who are supposed to share it," Thomas said, his tone uncertain. "Maybe it's too much for her right now." Rachel didn't have an answer. All she knew was that their once joyful daughter was retreating further into herself, the weight of her mission too heavy for her small shoulders to bear. Things came to a head during a community event at the church. Pastor Greg had asked the Adams family to share Emily's story, but the questions turned hostile as soon as they started. One woman raised her hand, her tone sharp. "Why should we believe this? She's 5 years old. Kids say all kinds of things." Another man chimed in. "Sounds like you're just trying to get attention. What's next? A book deal?" Thomas clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he fought to stay calm. Rachel's face burned with embarrassment and frustration, but before she could respond, Emily spoke up. "I'm not lying," she said, trembling but firm. "Jesus told me to tell you because he loves you. Even if you don't believe me, he still loves you." The room fell silent, her words hanging heavy in the air. But the damage had been done. On the way home, Emily sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. When they got home, she went straight to her room without saying a word. Rachel and Thomas sat at the kitchen table that night, the weight of everything crashing down on them. "What do we do now?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We protect her," he said firmly. "Whatever that means, we do it." But how could they protect Emily from a world that wasn't ready to listen? And how could they help her carry a message that seemed too big for her small shoulders, haunted by unseen watchers? The house was never the same after Emily began sharing her story. At first, the strange happenings seemed like coincidences. Rachel would notice the living room lights flickering when Emily spoke about her time with Jesus. But she chalked it up to an old electrical circuit. Thomas found himself shivering in his workshop, despite the heater working perfectly, but he dismissed it as winter drafts sneaking in through cracks. But soon, the events grew harder to ignore. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Emily suddenly froze her fork halfway to her mouth. "They're here," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a corner of the room. Rachel and Thomas exchanged a glance. "Who's here, sweetie?" Rachel asked, her voice calm but tinged with unease. "The Watchers," Emily said matter-of-factly, her gaze unblinking. "They're watching us." Rachel's hand tightened around her napkin, her knuckles white. "What do you mean, Watchers?" she pressed. Emily shrugged as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "They're not bad," she said, "but they're always there. They're waiting." "For what?" Thomas asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Emily didn't answer. Instead, she picked up her fork and continued eating as though the conversation hadn't happened. But the tension in the room lingered long after dinner was over. That night, as Rachel tucked Emily into bed, she noticed something on her daughter's desk. It was a stack of drawings, the kind Emily loved to make. But these weren't her usual colorful sketches of flowers and animals. These were different. Dark. The figures Emily had drawn were shadowy and tall, with no faces, standing in what looked like a barren landscape. "Emily, what are these?" Rachel asked, holding up one of the drawings. Emily sat up in bed, her expression calm but serious. "That's them," she said simply. Rachel's throat tightened. "The Watchers?" Emily nodded. "They stay at the edge of the light," she explained. "They don't come closer, but they see everything." Rachel stared at the picture, her heart pounding. "Why are you drawing them?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I see them," Emily replied, "even when you don't." Rachel tried to keep her composure, but the unease followed her throughout the night. She showed the drawings to Thomas after Emily fell asleep, hoping he would have a logical explanation. "It's probably just her imagination," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. He rubbed his temples and sighed. "She's been through so much, Rach. Maybe this is how she's processing it." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening. "What if it's not her imagination?" she asked. "What if they're real?" Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he stared at the drawing in his hands, a jagged, ominous landscape with looming shadows that seemed to reach out of the paper. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt in his own skepticism. Their experience is not unique. Consider the case of Elizabeth Devaney, a 39-year-old Irish woman who survived a near-death experience due to a misdiagnosed blood clot. Following her ordeal, Elizabeth suffered from chronic thromboembolic disease and emphasized the need for proper mental health support for survivors of similar health crises. Similarly, the Addams family faced a series of unexplainable events that deepened their fear and confusion. The strange occurrences continued. Lights flickered unpredictably, sometimes buzzing loudly before dimming entirely. The air in the house often felt heavy, especially at night. Rachel swore she heard footsteps in the hallway when everyone was in bed, but every time she checked, the house was empty. The temperature dropped suddenly one night as the family gathered in the living room. Thomas, flipping through the channels, paused and looked around. "Is it just me or is it freezing in here?" he asked, pulling his sweatshirt tighter. Rachel nodded, rubbing her arms. "I'll check the thermostat." But Emily spoke before Rachel could get up. "They're here again," she said, her voice soft but steady. Rachel stopped mid-step. "The Watchers?" she asked. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the empty corner of the room. "They're closer tonight." Thomas's jaw tightened as he stood. "Emily, there's no one here," he said firmly. "You're safe." Emily turned to him, her expression calm but unshakable. "You can't see them," she said. "But I can." Her words sent a chill down Rachel's spine. She reached for Emily's hand, squeezing it tightly. "What do they want, sweetheart?" she asked. Emily looked down at her lap, her small shoulders shrugging. "I don't know," she said. "They just watch." Over the next few days, Emily's behavior began to change. She spent more time alone in her room, repeatedly drawing the same haunting landscapes. When Rachel asked about them, Emily said, "They're what I see." The drawings became darker and more detailed. In one, the Watchers stood in a circle around a glowing figure, Emily. In another, they loomed over a crumbling city, their shadows stretching across the sky. Rachel couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. She confided in Thomas late one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm scared," she admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. What if something's happening to her? Something we can't explain? Thomas wrapped an arm around her, though his own unease was clear. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his tone was uncertain. "Maybe we should talk to Pastor Greg. He might have some answers." When Rachel showed him one of Emily's drawings, his face darkened. "This is troubling," he admitted. "But I don't know what to make of it. Have you considered seeing a counselor? Someone who can help her work through this?" Rachel's frustration boiled over. "She doesn't need a counselor," she snapped. "She needs someone who believes her." Greg hesitated, then sighed. "Rachel, sometimes children interpret things in ways that feel real to them, but that doesn't mean they are real." Rachel left the church feeling more alone than ever. One night, the strange events reached a peak. Emily had been restless all evening, pacing the house and mumbling to herself. "They're so close," she kept saying, her voice trembling. Thomas tried to reassure her, but nothing seemed to help. "You're safe, Emily," he said, crouching down to meet her gaze. "Whatever you think is out there, it can't hurt you." But Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "They're not outside," she whispered. "They're in the house." The words sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. She and Thomas exchanged a look, their fear mirrored in each other's eyes. That night, as the family tried to sleep, the house seemed to come alive. Doors creaked open and shut. The lights flickered constantly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then there was the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a low humming noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rachel and Thomas rushed to Emily's room, only to find her sitting on the floor, surrounded by her drawings. She looked up at them, her face pale but calm. "They're waiting," she said simply. "Waiting for what?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking. Emily looked at her mother, her eyes filled with both fear and understanding. "For me to remember," she said. The words sent a chill through Rachel and Thomas. What was Emily supposed to remember? And what would happen when she did? The line between faith and fear had blurred, leaving the family to wonder if they were witnessing a miracle or something far more terrifying. A final message of hope. As days turned into weeks, Emily's demeanor shifted again. She became quieter and more introspective, as if carrying a weight too great for her small frame. Rachel and Thomas noticed the change, but didn't press her for answers, fearing it might overwhelm her. Still, the air in the house was thick with anticipation. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Emily finally broke her silence. She didn't announce her thoughts dramatically or call for attention. Instead, she began speaking softly, her voice calm yet resolute, as if recounting a truth she had been holding on to for too long. She spoke of visions, vivid images that Rachel and Thomas could feel their weight even as they listened. Emily described a world gripped by chaos, vast fires consuming forests and homes, waves towering over cities, and people fleeing in fear. She painted pictures of war, where the sound of crying children and the clash of weapons filled the air. These weren't just physical disasters, Emily explained, but signs of a deeper decay, a spiritual decay that had taken root in humanity. Rachel's hand trembled as she listened, clutching Thomas's tightly. The enormity of Emily's words was almost too much to bear. She spoke of selfishness, hatred, and apathy, which had grown so deeply into people's hearts that they no longer saw the damage they were causing, not just to the world, but to each other. But amidst the darkness, Emily's voice grew steadier, as if recalling something brighter. She said Jesus didn't only show her destruction, he also showed her what could be. She described a world transformed by love, where people reached out to one another, where kindness and faith replaced anger and fear. The world could heal, Jesus had told her, but only if people chose to change. It was not too late, but the time to act was growing short. Emily hesitated for a moment, glancing down at her small hands. Her voice wavered as she admitted her greatest fear, not the visions she had seen, but the possibility that people wouldn't listen. "What if they don't believe?" she asked quietly, her gaze far away. The weight of that question lingered, pressing down on everyone in the room. Rachel and Thomas exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with both awe and worry. They knew the enormity of what Emily was saying and how difficult it would be for people to accept such a message. But they also knew their daughter wasn't inventing this. Her words carried a depth and certainty that no child her age could fabricate. Emily's final revelation came not with grand fanfare, but with quiet clarity. She explained her role, not as a savior, but as a vessel, someone chosen to carry this message and share it with the world. She not only meant to solve the problems herself, but to open people's eyes to the choices they still had. And while she was afraid, she understood now why Jesus had sent her back. Rachel felt tears welling in her eyes as she watched Emily speak. This was her little girl, the child who loved drawing and dancing in the yard, now shouldering a mission far beyond what anyone could comprehend. Yet Emily didn't seem burdened anymore. There was peace about her, as if accepting her role had lifted the weight she had been carrying. Thomas, too, felt a sense of clarity wash over him. He had spent weeks doubting, questioning, and trying to rationalize everything Emily said. But now, as he listened to her, he couldn't deny the truth of it. "We have to trust," he said finally, his voice steady but soft. "We have to trust that God knows what he's doing." Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. She pulled Emily close, holding her tightly as if she could shield her from the weight of the world. "We'll help you, sweetheart," she whispered. "Whatever happens, we'll be with you." In the days that followed, the family began to find a sense of peace amidst the chaos. They stopped worrying about the doubts of others or the whispers in their small town. Instead, they focused on supporting Emily and finding ways to share her message. It wasn't about convincing people. It was about planting a seed of hope, of faith, and of change. Emily's final revelation left an indelible mark on her family. It was more than just the warning of what could happen that stuck with them. It was the promise of what could be if humanity chose love over fear. For Rachel and Thomas, it was not about having all the answers or understanding everything Emily had seen. It was about trusting in something greater than themselves. As Emily sat by the window one afternoon, gazing out at the sky, Rachel joined her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting a mix of wisdom and innocence. "The garden," she said simply. "It's always there, waiting." Rachel felt a lump in her throat. "Do you miss it?" Emily shook her head. "I'll go back someday," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "But for now, I have to stay." Rachel reached for Emily's hand, holding it tightly. In that moment, she knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, guided by faith and the love that had always anchored their family. The Addams family resolved to live each day with purpose, trusting in the plan God had set for them. They didn't have all the answers, but they had something better: hope. And in the end, hope was enough. And that's Emily's story. A journey from death to life with a warning that could change the world. Do you believe her message was a wake-up call for all of us? If this story intrigues you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful tales that challenge everything you thought you knew. See you next time.